The room was dark, except for the thin blade of moonlight cutting through the half-closed curtains. And in that blade of light, Serafina Vale was frozen. A man sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows rested on his knees, his head was bowed.
Then she saw the gun in his hand.
Lucian.
And his name came out of her like something breaking. He lifted his head, and what she saw in his eyes was not the man who had held her 3 nights ago and told her he'd spent 9 years looking for her. "Tell me the truth," he said. His voice did not rise. That was the terrifying part. Serafina's eyes filled before she could stop them. "I didn't have a choice," she said. Something moved behind his eyes. He raised the pistol. Not high, just enough that the moonlight caught the barrel and turned it silver.
"Why?" he said. "Did you kill my brother?"
The room was dark, except for the thin blade of moonlight cutting through the half-closed curtains, and in that blade of light, Serafina Vale was frozen. She would remember, later, every single detail of that room. The way the air conditioner hummed too loud for how cold the room actually was. The way the bedsheets were still rumpled from an afternoon that had felt, only hours earlier, like the happiest afternoon of her life. The way dust floated lazily in that one strip of moonlight, completely indifferent to the fact that her entire world was about to end. A man sat on the edge of the bed. His elbows rested on his knees. His head was bowed, dark hair falling forward, so that for one absurd, suspended second, she almost mistook his posture for exhaustion, for grief, for the same heavy tiredness she'd seen in him after long nights of business she was never allowed to ask about. Then she saw the gun in his hand. It wasn't pointed at her. Not yet. It simply existed in his grip, low and loose, the way a man holds something he has held 1,000 times before and has never once had to think about holding. "Lucian," she whispered, and his name came out of her like something breaking. He lifted his head, and when Serafina looked into his eyes, she did not see the man who had pulled her into his chest 3 nights ago and told her, in a voice cracked open with feeling, that he had spent 9 years looking for her. She did not see the man who made her laugh so hard on their second date that she'd nearly choked on wine. She saw something colder, older, a man built by a world she had only ever seen the edges of. "Tell me the truth," he said. His voice did not rise. That was the terrifying part. It stayed level, almost gentle, the way you'd speak to a child you were trying not to frighten, except every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Serafina's eyes filled before she could stop them. She pressed a hand to her stomach without meaning to, an instinct so new to her she hadn't yet learned to hide it, and felt the fresh little secret pulse of a life he did not yet know existed. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I didn't have a choice." Something moved behind Lucian's eyes. Not softness. Something worse. The specific, terrible stillness of a man deciding whether he could still love someone after what he was about to ask her. He raised the gun. Not high. Just enough that the moonlight caught the barrel and turned it silver. "Why?" he said. "Did you kill my brother?" The screen went black. "Hey, welcome back to Silver S Dramas. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because trust me, you do not want to miss where this story goes. And if you've been with us before, you already know the drill. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what you think Serafina is about to say, and let's get into it. Because that moment you just watched, that's not the beginning of this story. That's the end of it. To understand how the woman Lucian Moretti loves ended up with his gun pointed at her chest, we have to go back. 6 months, to be exact. Back before the blood. Back before the lies. Back to 2 sisters who thought the worst thing that could happen to them was a bad landlord and a broken heater. The city of Calderosa did not do subtlety. It was a city of extremes. Glittering rooftop bars perched directly above pawn shops that never seemed to close. Cathedral bells competing with the bass thumping out of a nightclub 2 blocks over. Old money and blood money occupying the same 6-block radius and pretending very hard not to notice each other. It was, depending on which street you turned down, either the most romantic city in the world or the most dangerous one. Most people who lived there had simply stopped trying to tell the difference. Serafina Vale had lived in Calderosa her entire life, and she had exactly one rule about the city. Never, Under any circumstances, trust a man who tips well at a restaurant he clearly can't afford. It was a rule she had developed at 19, refined at 23, and by the time she turned 28, had elevated into something like scripture, preached almost weekly to the only person who had to listen to her because she was, biologically, contractually obligated to. That person was currently standing in their shared kitchen wearing one sock, holding a spatula like a microphone, singing directly into Serafina's unimpressed face. "Alara Rosevale," Serafina said, arms crossed, leaning in the doorway with the specific exhaustion of an older sister who had had this exact argument roughly 400 times. "We do not have time for a concert. You have work in 40 minutes. "I am multitasking," Alara said solemnly, flipping a pancake with a flourish that sent a small constellation of batter across the ceiling. "I am cooking. I am singing. I am," several people would argue, "thriving. Several people would argue you're going to burn our apartment down." Slander. Alara pointed the spatula at her sister like a sword. "Defamation. I want my lawyer. Your lawyer is me, and I am declining the case." Alara grinned, that wide, unguarded, gap-toothed grin she'd had since she was 7 years old, the one that used to get her out of every single piece of trouble their mother tried to put her in, and turned back to the stove, humming under her breath, hips swaying slightly to a song only she could hear. She was 21, 3 months out of her final university exams, and still floating in that strange golden window of life where every possibility feels open and none of them feel like they'll cost you anything. Serafina, 7 years older, had already learned exactly how much everything cost. She'd learned it the hard way, at 19, when their parents died within 11 months of each other, and she'd quietly folded up every plan she'd ever had for herself and become, instead, the person who paid the electricity bill on time. She didn't resent it. Not exactly. But there were mornings just like this one, with batter on the ceiling and Alara singing off-key, and sunlight pouring gold through the kitchen window, when Serafina looked at her sister and felt something in her chest go soft and fierce at the same time, like her whole heart had relocated permanently outside her body and taken up residence in this one loud, ridiculous, wonderful girl. "You're staring at me," Alara said, without turning around. "It's weird. Stop it. I'm not staring. You're doing the face. I raised you and I'm proud of you, but I will never say it out loud because I have the emotional vocabulary of a brick face. That's an oddly specific face to have a name for. I've had 7 years to study it." Alara slid a pancake onto a plate and presented it with the theatrical grandeur of a chef on a cooking show. "Eat. You skip breakfast every day and then you get mean by 2 o'clock, and I refuse to deal with mean Serafina before I've had my coffee." Serafina took the plate, mostly because arguing with Alara before 9 in the morning was a battle she had never once won. She was still eating, standing at the counter, when Alara's phone buzzed against the tile with the particular rattle of a text message. Alara glanced at it. Something flickered across her face, brief, quickly smoothed over, before she flipped the phone face down and reached for her coffee. "Who was that?" Serafina asked, because 7 years of being the only adult in a 2-person household had turned her into a human lie detector where Alara was concerned. "Nobody. Alara. It's nothing, Sarah. Seriously." Alara's smile came back, quick and easy, the kind of smile Serafina would only recognize much later as a door closing rather than opening. "Just some guy from that gallery thing last month being weird. I'll handle it." Serafina let it go. That was the first mistake, though she wouldn't know it for weeks. The small, human, completely understandable mistake of believing your little sister when she tells you she can handle something. She had no way of knowing, standing in that sunlit kitchen with pancake batter drying on the ceiling, that the man behind that text message had a last name that would eventually be carved into every headline in Calderosa. She had no way of knowing his name was Dante Moretti, and that he had already decided, 3 weeks earlier, that Alara Vale belonged to him. Dante Moretti had never once in his life heard the word no and taken it seriously. This was not entirely his fault, in the way that very few things about a Moretti were entirely their own fault. He had been raised inside a family where doors opened before he reached for them, where teachers gave him grades he hadn't earned because his last name made their insurance premiums nervous, where the concept of consequence had been, for his entire 26 years of life, something that happened to other people. His older brother Lucien had left the family years ago, walked away from all of it, disappeared into a life nobody in the family spoke of anymore. And in his absence, Dante had inherited not just a piece of the empire, but the terrifying, unearned confidence that came with never once being told to sit down and shut up. He had met Alara Vale at an art gallery opening his cousin had dragged him to, the kind of event where wine cost more than most people's rent, and everyone stood very close to paintings they didn't understand while pretending to have opinions about them. Alara had been there because her friend had a piece in the show, a chaotic, colorful thing involving broken glass and dried flowers that Alara privately thought looked like an argument that had been resolved with craft supplies. But she'd shown up with a bottle of cheap Prosecco tucked in her bag and a whole speech prepared about found art as emotional archaeology, ready to lie through her teeth for her friend's sake. She had been standing in front of the piece, mid-lie, gesturing enthusiastically at a particularly aggressive shard of glass, when she noticed a man watching her from across the room. Not the painting. Her. At first, she'd found it flattering. He was handsome, in the sharp-jawed, expensively tailored way that always seemed to come with a story you didn't want to hear the ending of. He'd bought her a drink. He'd laughed at her joke about found art being emotional archaeology, or possibly just a cry for help. A little too hard, a little too long, in a way that should have told her something but didn't, because she was 21 and it was flattering to be looked at like that. By the end of the night, she had politely declined his number 3 times and given it to him on the 4th, mostly to end the conversation, the way you say yes to a timeshare presentation just to get out of the room. It took 4 days for the messages to become too many. It took 11 days for too many to become constant. By the 3rd week, Dante Moretti had appeared, unannounced, at the cafe where Alara worked part-time between graduation and figuring out her actual life plan, sitting in the corner booth for 3 hours nursing a single cup of coffee, watching her work with an expression the other baristas would later describe, when the police finally asked, as creepy in a way we didn't have a word for. Alara had laughed it off, at first, the way you laugh off things that scare you a little, because laughing feels safer than admitting you're scared. She told her coworkers he was intense. She told herself he was going through something. She told Serafina, when Serafina finally pried it out of her over dinner one night, that it was handled. It was not handled. The night everything tipped from unsettling into undeniable. Alara came home 40 minutes later than usual, and Serafina knew before her sister even got the key fully in the lock that something was wrong. Alara's hands were shaking. Her mascara had run in 2 thin gray lines down her cheeks, the kind that only happen when someone has been crying for a while and trying very hard to stop. Hey, what happened? Serafina was up off the couch before Alara had even closed the door, hands hovering, not quite touching, the way you approach someone who looks like they might shatter if you're not careful. Talk to me. He followed me from work. Alara's voice came out small, and small was not a register Alara's voice had ever operated in. Not once in Serafina's memory, and that more than anything was what made ice slide down Serafina's spine. All the way to the train station. He walked right next to me, and he kept talking like we were friends, like nothing was wrong. And when I told him to leave me alone, he smiled. Sarah. He smiled, and he said. She stopped, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. He said what? Serafina's voice had gone very quiet, very flat, in the specific way it went right before she did something about a problem. He said I was going to love him eventually. Everyone does. Alara laughed, but it came out wrong, jagged at the edges. Like it was a fact. Like it was just inevitable. Like I don't get a say in it. Serafina pulled her sister into a hug, so tight it should have hurt, and Alara let herself be held, let herself finally shake the way she'd been holding back on the train, on the walk home, at the front door with her hand not quite steady enough to fit the key on the first try. Okay, Serafina murmured into her hair. Okay, we're reporting this. Tonight. Sarah. Tonight, Alara. I'm not asking. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, and the officer who took their report, a tired man named Reyes with the particular weariness of someone who has heard every version of this story too many times, wrote everything down with a diligence that gave Serafina a brief, fragile hope that something might actually happen. That hope lasted exactly 6 days. They're not pursuing it, Serafina said, standing in the kitchen with the phone still in her hand, staring at it like it had personally betrayed her. They said there's not enough for a restraining order. Not enough evidence of credible threat. What does that even mean? Alara had gone very still on the couch, knees pulled up to her chest. It means his family made a call. Serafina's jaw tightened. She'd done some digging of her own over those 6 days. Quiet, careful digging. The kind you do when you're a paralegal by profession and you know exactly which public records to pull, and what she'd found had settled into her stomach like a stone. Alara, do you know who Dante Moretti's family is? Alara shook her head slowly. They're not just rich. Serafina sat down across from her, choosing her words with the care of someone defusing something. They're Moretti. As in, the name people in this city say a little quieter than other names. As in, I called a friend from the courthouse and she laughed at me. Not because it was funny, because it was that unlikely. Alara went pale. So what? We just let him keep doing this. No. Serafina reached across and took her sister's hand, and there was something in her expression that Alara hadn't seen since they were teenagers, since the funeral, since the version of Serafina who had once stood between 11-year-old Alara and an entire room of well-meaning adults trying to separate them into different foster placements, and simply refused, flatly and immovably, to let it happen. We don't let him keep doing this. We just have to be smarter about it than the system is willing to be. Okay, I've got you. Their landlord, a stooped, endlessly nosy man named Mr. Faulkner, who considered himself the unofficial mayor of the building's 4 floors, chose that exact moment to knock on the door about a leaked 2 apartments over that had, somehow, in his mind, become Serafina's responsibility to solve. He stood in the doorway in his bathrobe at 9 in the evening, clutching a flashlight he had no apparent intention of using, and launched into a full accounting of the building's plumbing history dating back, as far as Serafina could tell, to the Eisenhower administration. Mr. Faulkner, Serafina said, with the particular patience of a woman who had just spent an hour at a police station and did not currently have the emotional bandwidth for pipe genealogy, I don't own the building. No, but you're reasonable, he said, as though this were a job title. The Hendersons upstairs are not reasonable. The Hendersons think I'm the one causing the leak out of spite. Are you? That is not relevant to this conversation. From the couch, Alara, mascara still faintly visible beneath her eyes, but grinning now, actually grinning, at the sheer absurdity of Mr. Faulkner's timing, called out, "Tell him we'll consider it if he stops leaving his recycling in front of our door." That recycling is labeled, Mr. Faulkner said, deeply wounded, and shuffled off down the hallway still muttering about the Hendersons, leaving both sisters alone with a silence that, for the first time all evening, didn't feel quite so heavy. I love that man, Alara said, wiping her eyes, laughing now for real. In the specific way you love a fire alarm that goes off for no reason. Comforting, in its consistency. He's going to outlive us both out of spite. Please don't joke about outliving people right now. I've had a day. Fair. Serafina reached over and squeezed her sister's hand. Come on, get in your pajamas. We're watching something stupid, and we're not thinking about Dante Moretti for the rest of the night. It would become, in the weeks that followed, one of the last truly peaceful nights the 2 sisters would ever share. The 2 of them curled on the same worn couch they'd had since college, a blanket between them. A genuinely terrible reality show playing on mute in the background because neither of them could focus enough to follow the plot. Alara's head eventually finding its way onto Serafina's shoulder the way it had 1,000 times before. Serafina would replay this exact night, later, more times than she could count. She would give anything, everything, to have known, in that moment, just how little time was left. Quick pause before we go further. If you're already feeling that knot in your stomach, that's exactly where I need you. So go ahead and smash that like button right now, because trust me, it only gets heavier from here. Comment below if you've already got a bad feeling about Dante Moretti, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because what happens to these sisters next is going to change everything. The weeks that followed had the strange, suspended quality of a held breath. Dante did not disappear, but he did become quieter about it. The messages fewer, the visits to the cafe less frequent, enough that Alara allowed herself, cautiously, to believe it might actually be ending. She threw herself back into ordinary life. She picked up extra shifts. She started, tentatively, filling out applications for a junior curator position at a small gallery downtown, the kind of unglamorous entry-level job that would have made their mother, who used to drag both girls to every free museum exhibit in the city, narrating each painting in dramatic, invented backstories neither daughter ever forgot, impossibly proud. "I think I actually have a shot at this one," Alara said one evening, laptop balanced on her knees, chewing the end of a pen with the specific intensity of someone rewriting a cover letter for the 9th time. "The curator liked my thesis. She said the thing about found object installations was refreshingly unpretentious, which I choose to interpret as the nicest thing anyone has ever said about me." "It is objectively the nicest thing anyone has ever said about you," Serafina said from the kitchen, not looking up from the bills she was sorting. "I've met you. Unpretentious is a stretch. I contain multitudes. You contain a lot of things. Multitudes might be generous." Alara threw a couch cushion at her sister's head with startling accuracy for someone who claimed to have never played a single sport in her life. And for a moment, just a moment, the apartment was full of nothing but laughter, and it was easy, dangerously easy, to believe the worst part was already behind them. It wasn't. In the days between that quiet, laughter-filled evening and the Thursday that would end it all, Alara did something she'd never fully admit to Serafina, out of a stubborn, well-meaning desire to handle at least one thing in her life without her older sister's help. She went back to the courthouse on her own, twice, cornering a young clerk named Priscilla who'd taken pity on her the first time and quietly explained, off the record, how she might file a private petition that bypassed the police entirely. A petition that, if successful, would put Dante Moretti's name into a public record he couldn't simply make disappear with a phone call. "It's a long shot," Priscilla had warned her, glancing nervously at the door as though the walls themselves might report back to someone. "Families like that usually have people watching for exactly this kind of filing. If he finds out you're doing this." "He won't," Alara said, with the specific, stubborn confidence of someone who has never once in her life been the target of that kind of surveillance, and therefore has no idea what it actually looks like. "I'll be careful." She was, by her own standards, careful. She filed the paperwork under a slightly misspelled version of her own name, a small clerical trick Priscilla suggested to buy a few extra days before it registered in any searchable system. She told no one, not her coworkers, not her sister, not even the friend whose gallery show had started this whole nightmare in the first place. She simply went to the station on that particular Thursday evening to check on the paperwork status, feeling, for the first time in weeks, something close to hope. What she did not know, what she had absolutely no way of knowing, was that the Moretti family's reach extended into exactly the kind of records office she'd just walked out of, and that a single, seemingly harmless phone call had already been made an hour before she'd even arrived. On a Thursday evening in late autumn, 3 weeks after the failed police report, Alara left the station where she'd gone to follow up. One final, stubborn attempt to get someone in an official capacity to take her seriously, and began the walk home along the river path that cut through the eastern edge of downtown Calderosa. It was a route she'd walked 100 times, lined with old iron lampposts and a low stone wall separating the footpath from a steep drop to the water below, the kind of pretty, unremarkable stretch of city that nobody ever thinks to be afraid of until they have a very specific reason to be. She didn't notice him at first. That was the thing that would haunt Serafina most in the terrible months afterward. That Alara, sharp and observant Alara, who could spot a fake designer bag from across a room and always knew when Serafina was lying about being fine, hadn't noticed the footsteps behind her until they were already too close. "Alara." She turned, and there he was. Dante Moretti, hands in the pockets of a coat that cost more than her monthly rent, wearing an expression of calm, easy confidence that made her stomach drop straight through the pavement. "I told you to stop," she said, and was proud, in that instant, of how steady her voice came out, even as every muscle in her body screamed at her to run. "I heard you filed another report." He shook his head slowly, almost fondly, like a parent disappointed in a child who kept making the same small mistake. "That wasn't smart, Alara. It's not going to work this time. I have a friend at the courthouse now. I have. You have nothing." His voice hadn't risen, but something underneath it had shifted, gone hard and flat in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. "You have a part-time job and a sister with a paralegal license, and absolutely no idea who you're dealing with. Then educate me. Alara snapped, anger briefly winning out over fear. The same reckless Vale family stubbornness that had gotten both sisters in trouble their whole lives. Because from where I'm standing, you're just a rich guy who can't take a hint. Something in his face changed. It happened fast, too fast for her to name it before it was already too late to matter. You think I'm going to just let you walk away and talk, he said, and his voice had dropped almost to a whisper now, which was somehow worse than shouting. You think I'm going to let you keep going to that courthouse, keep talking to your little friend, keep threatening my family's name over something that's never going to happen anyway? I'm not threatening anything. I just want you to leave me alone. You don't get to want things from me. He stepped closer. The lamppost above them flickered, a small, mundane malfunction that would later feel, in Alara's memory, replayed 1,000 times by people who weren't even there, like something out of a horror film. You don't get to say no and then go crying to the police and then act surprised when you what? She was backing away now, toward the low stone wall, toward the water she could hear moving somewhere below, dark and steady and completely indifferent to what was happening on the path above it. When I remind you, Dante said, that this ends when I decide it ends. He grabbed her arm. She wrenched away. Hard, sudden, the pure animal instinct of someone whose body understood the danger before her mind fully caught up. And the momentum of it, combined with the wet stone underfoot from an earlier rain, combined with the low wall that had never once in the history of that footpath needed to be higher, sent her stumbling backward. His hand came out. Not to catch her. To push. It happened in less than 2 seconds. The scrape of her shoe against wet stone. The brief, terrible weightlessness. The sound. A sound Dante Moretti would hear in his own head for the rest of his considerably shortened life. Of the water below swallowing something that had, until that exact moment, been a 21-year-old girl with a job application open on her laptop at home, and a curator who thought her thesis was refreshingly unpretentious. He stood at the wall for a long moment, breathing hard, looking down at the black water. Then he did what men like Dante Moretti had always done, his entire life, when something inconvenient happened. He turned around, and he walked away. Serafina got the call at 11:47 p.m. She would remember the exact time for the rest of her life, the way you remember the precise coordinates of the moment the ground opens beneath you. The official report, when it finally came, 3 excruciating days later, used words like accidental drowning and wet conditions and insufficient evidence of foul play. It described a young woman who had, tragically, lost her footing on a well-known hazard along the river path. It did not mention Dante Moretti. It did not mention the report Alara had filed 3 weeks earlier, sitting untouched in a drawer at a police station that had already decided, quietly, and without ever having to say so out loud, whose name was worth protecting. Serafina sat in the police station lobby, the same lobby where she'd once felt a flicker of hope, and read the report 3 times, and understood, with the cold, total clarity of grief curdling into something else entirely, exactly what had happened to her sister, and exactly who had made it happen. She did not cry in that lobby. She would cry plenty, later, alone, in the shower, in the middle of the night with her sister's hoodie pressed to her face because it still smelled like her. But not there, not in front of the same system that had already failed Alara once, and clearly intended to keep failing her, even in death. In that lobby, Serafina Vale simply folded the report closed, tucked it into her bag, and walked out into a city that had no idea what it had just done. Okay, I need everyone watching this to take a breath with me, because I know that scene hit hard. If you're feeling that anger right now, that's exactly what Serafina is feeling, and trust me, she is not the type of woman who lets anger sit still for very long. Before we keep going, drop a comment for Alara. Let her know she's not forgotten, and hit subscribe, because what Serafina does next is going to change the entire direction of this story. Grief, Serafina would learn in the weeks that followed, did not arrive the way movies had always promised it would. It didn't announce itself in a single devastating wave and then recede. It came in strange, uneven pulses, a full 10 minutes of numb, mechanical function, folding laundry, answering emails, followed by the sudden gut punch of finding one of Alara's hair ties in the couch cushions and having to sit down on the kitchen floor until she could breathe again. But underneath the grief, quietly, patiently, something else was growing. Something colder. Something with a very specific shape and a very specific name. Serafina had spent 7 years teaching herself to be careful, methodical, the kind of person who read every clause of a contract twice and kept receipts for everything. And now she turned that same relentless precision toward a single goal: finding out everything there was to know about Dante Moretti. She started, oddly enough, with grief itself, throwing herself into the funeral arrangements, the sympathy cards, the agonizing administrative debris that death leaves behind, because staying busy was the only thing keeping her upright. She donated Alara's clothes to the shelter 2 blocks from their apartment. Except for one hoodie she couldn't make herself let go of. She emailed the curator at the gallery, the one who'd called Alara's thesis refreshingly unpretentious, and received back a message so kind, so genuinely devastated, that Serafina had to close her laptop and sit on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes before she could breathe normally again. And underneath all of it, in the hours when the grief briefly loosened its grip, the other thing kept growing. It wasn't difficult, exactly, once she knew where to look. Men like Dante left trails, because men like Dante had never once had to learn to be careful. The world had always been careful for them. She learned his routine. The gym he favored on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The restaurant where he had a standing table every Friday night. The fact that he'd been seen, twice, at the exact bar 3 blocks from the river path, drinking alone, in the 2 weeks since Alara's death, like a man circling the scene of something he couldn't quite leave behind. She learned, too, through a contact of a contact, a bartender who owed her a favor from a legal aid case years earlier, that Dante had a habit of talking when he drank, that he'd been overheard, late one night, muttering something about a girl who should have just been smart about it, and a family that would handle things if it ever came back to bite him. She kept a notebook, small, unassuming, the kind of thing that could pass for a grocery list if anyone ever thumbed through her bag, and filled its pages in her tight, careful paralegal handwriting with times, dates, patterns. Tuesday, 6:15 a.m., gym, alone, leaves by 7:40. Friday, 8 p.m., corner table at Renata's, usually with 2 associates, gone by 11. She surprised herself with how easily the old professional instincts took over. The same instincts that had once made her excellent at building airtight timelines for insurance disputes now repurposed towards something she couldn't have named, even to herself, without the whole thing collapsing under its own weight. There were nights she sat in her car outside that bar, engine off, watching his silhouette through frosted glass, and asked herself, with brutal honesty, what exactly she thought she was doing. She had no plan. Not really. She told herself, in the beginning, that she only wanted enough to finally force someone's hand. A journalist, maybe, someone outside the reach of a family that had already proven it could make an entire police report evaporate. But somewhere in those long, cold nights behind the wheel, watching a man laugh with friends as though he hadn't emptied out the whole center of her life 3 weeks earlier, the plan had quietly stopped being about justice through proper channels. And neither Serafina nor anyone watching her would ever be able to pinpoint the precise night it happened. It was not proof. It would never hold up in any courtroom, not against a family with the Moretti name attached to it. But Serafina had stopped believing, somewhere in that police station lobby, that courtrooms were where this particular story was going to end. She found him on a Tuesday night, in the alley behind the bar he favored, 3 weeks to the day after Alara's funeral. He was alone. He was always alone. Lately, something in him clearly fraying at the edges even if he couldn't name what it was, and when he saw her step out of the shadows, he actually smiled. "You're the sister," he said, and there was something almost lazy in his tone, the specific arrogance of a man who had never once believed consequences could find their way to him. "Serafina, right? I heard you've been asking questions about me." "I have." He laughed. An actual laugh, short and disbelieving. The laugh of a man encountering an inconvenience so small he couldn't quite believe it had bothered to introduce itself. "You've been asking questions. My cousin mentioned it. Said some woman's been showing up places, talking to bartenders, real amateur hour stuff." He shook his head, almost admiring, in the way you might admire a child's crayon drawing of something far more complicated than a child could actually understand. "I have to say, it's kind of impressive. Misguided, but impressive. You should stop." He took a step closer, unbothered, and Serafina noted. Filed away, the way she'd learned to file away every detail of every conversation with this family. The faint slur in his voice, the loose, careless way he was standing. It's not going to go anywhere. Whatever you think you know, whatever you think happened out there. I know what happened. Her voice didn't shake. She'd spent 3 weeks making sure it wouldn't. I know you followed her. I know you grabbed her. I know she went into that water because of you. And I know the only reason you're standing here right now, telling me to stop asking questions, is because your family bought your way out of ever having to answer them. Something flickered across his face. Not guilt, never guilt, but a kind of irritated impatience. The look of a man being inconvenienced by a fact he'd hoped had already been buried along with the girl. She should have just been smart about it, he said, and the casualness of it, the sheer, breathtaking casualness of a man describing the death of a 21-year-old woman like a minor scheduling conflict, was the thing that finally, completely broke something loose inside Serafina Vale that would never fully settle back into place. Nobody is ever going to touch me for this, Dante went on, stepping closer still, close enough now that she could smell the whiskey on him. You understand that, right? You can dig up whatever you want. You can talk to whoever you want. Nobody in this city is going to put a Moretti on trial for a girl who slipped on a wet sidewalk. She didn't slip. Prove it. I don't need to prove it in a courtroom. Serafina's voice had dropped, low and even, and something in the shift made Dante's smile falter for the first time since she'd stepped out of the shadows. I just needed to know. And now I do. Know what? That your sister was clumsy near a river. The cruelty of it landed exactly where he intended it to. A blade aimed precisely at the softest, most unguarded part of her, and for a moment white-hot fury blurred the edges of Serafina's vision. Look, I get it. You're grieving. You want someone to blame. But that doesn't make it. He didn't finish the sentence. He smiled again, and it was that smile, easy, untroubled, utterly certain of its own impunity, that Serafina would replay, later, as the exact instant something in her stopped being able to walk away. What happened next happened fast, and in fragments, the way trauma always does. A struggle, his hand closing too hard around her wrist. Something metal, cold, heavy, that had been sitting in her bag for 3 weeks, ever since a night she couldn't fully admit to herself she'd been preparing for. A brief, violent thrash of motion in a dark alley that ended, seconds later, with Dante Moretti on the wet pavement and Serafina Vale standing over him, chest heaving, hands shaking. The person she had been that morning gone somewhere she would spend the rest of her life trying and failing to get back to. She stood there for a long moment. Long enough to hear, somewhere above her, the faint scrape of a window sliding shut. Long enough to feel, prickling along the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned. The alley behind her was empty, or seemed to be. A shadow shifted at the far end, near the mouth of the street. There, and then gone. Too quick to name, too deliberate to have been nothing. Serafina did not wait to find out who it was. She ran. If your heart is racing right now, good. That means this story is doing exactly what it's supposed to. Comment below and tell me, do you think Serafina had a choice? Or did Dante Moretti finally get what he had coming? I want to hear it. And make sure you're subscribed, because that shadow in the alley? That's not a throwaway detail. That's about to matter more than you think. 9 years is a long time to spend not knowing where someone is. Lucien Moretti had learned to live with the not knowing the way you learn to live with a permanently sore joint. You stop noticing it, mostly, except on the days the weather changes and it aches in a way that reminds you it never actually healed. He had walked away from his family at 19, disgusted by a version of power he wanted no part of, and he had built, in the years since, an entirely separate life on the other side of the country, a shipping logistics company that was, on paper, entirely legitimate, and a name that carried none of the weight his father's had. He had done it, in part, out of principle. He had done it, in larger part, because staying inside that family had meant staying inside a world he had never wanted for himself. But leaving the family had also meant leaving her. He still thought about Serafina sometimes, in the specific, involuntary way you think about the person who defined your entire concept of before everything got complicated. They had grown up 2 houses apart, before his family's fortunes changed and his father's ambitions swallowed his childhood whole, before his parents' bitter, Protracted separation had scattered the family across 3 different cities and buried whatever records might have let a 19-year-old boy find the girl he'd once promised, in the reckless, absolute way only teenagers can promise things that he would love forever. He had tried to find her in the early years. He'd hired people, quietly, discreetly, never quite admitting to himself how much it mattered, and every trail had gone cold. Vale was a common enough surname. Calderosa was a big enough city. Eventually, the searching had become one more ache he'd learned to carry without examining too closely. He had built his own name, too. Lucien Marchetti, on every contract and every business card. A small, deliberate distortion of his own surname that let him move through the world without the particular weight of being a Moretti preceding him into every room. It had cost him things, that choice. It had cost him his father's approval for the better part of a decade, cost him any relationship with a mother who'd remarried into a different kind of quiet cruelty and preferred not to be reminded of the son who'd walked away from the family's money on principle. But it had also given him something he suspected none of his cousins had ever once experienced, a Tuesday that belonged entirely to him, unconnected to anyone else's ambitions. He had not spoken to his brother in 3 years when the call came. Lucien, his father's voice, on the phone, sounded older than Lucien remembered, cracked in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the words that came next. It's Dante. Despite everything, the distance, the years, the version of family loyalty Lucien had spent his adult life trying to define on his own terms, the news landed like a blow to the chest. Because whatever else Dante had become, whatever cruelty had calcified in him in the years since Lucien left, there had also been a version of him Lucien remembered fiercely protecting. A scrawny, asthmatic 9-year-old hiding behind Lucien's legs during their parents' worst arguments. A boy who used to sneak into Lucien's room during thunderstorms and pretend he wasn't scared. Lucien had failed to protect him from what their family turned him into. He was not going to fail to show up now. He was back in Calderosa within 18 hours. The flight had given him far too much time to think, which was, in Lucien's experience, always a dangerous amount of time to hand a man who had spent 9 years carefully not thinking about certain things. He thought about the last real conversation he'd had with Dante, a phone call, for years ago, that had ended badly, Dante accusing him of abandoning the family out of cowardice dressed up as principal, Lucien accusing Dante of never once having the courage to ask why Lucien left in the first place. Neither of them had called back to apologize. Neither of them, Lucien now understood with the particular clarity that only arrives too late, had ever imagined they'd run out of time to. He thought, too, helplessly, the way you think about a splinter you know you should leave alone, about Serafina. About the version of her frozen permanently in his memory at 17, laughing on the roof of her parents' garage where they used to sneak up to watch the sunset, promising him in that fierce, half-joking, entirely serious way of hers that no matter what happened to either of their families, she would find a way back to him. He hadn't thought of her, consciously, in months. But grief, he was learning all over again, has a way of dragging up every other unfinished thing in a person's chest at once, and by the time the plane touched down, he felt like a man carrying 2 separate kinds of loss he didn't yet have the language to untangle from each other. The city had changed in 9 years, and also not at all. The same collision of old money and worse habits, the same skyline he used to hate, and, standing at the window of his father's study for the first time in nearly a decade, found himself surprised to feel something almost like relief at seeing again. They're calling it an isolated incident, his father said, pacing behind a desk that had not moved an inch in 20 years. A robbery. A mugging that went wrong. His father's face, weathered and tight with a grief he would never fully allow himself to show, twisted with something closer to fury. It wasn't a robbery, Lucien. Nothing was taken. And I have people telling me the police report is being handled with unusual cooperation. Meaning what? Meaning someone is being protected. And it isn't your brother. Lucien felt something cold settle into his chest. The specific, familiar cold of a man being pulled, however reluctantly, back into the machinery of a world he'd sworn off. You have a name? His father slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, A security camera angled toward the mouth of an alley 2 blocks from a bar Dante had apparently frequented in his final weeks. It showed a young woman with dark hair, her face turned just enough that most of it was obscured, standing over a shape on the ground that could have been anything in the low light, except that everyone in that room already knew exactly what it was. Nobody knows who she is yet, his father said, but she's the last person anyone can place with him. Find her, Lucien. Find out what happened to your brother. Lucien picked up the photograph. Something about the set of the woman's shoulders, the particular, unmistakable way she was standing, weight on one hip, arms crossed protectively over her own chest, even in a moment of apparent violence, snagged at a memory so old and so deeply buried, he almost didn't trust it. He told himself it was nothing. Grief playing tricks. A ghost he'd been chasing for 9 years, projected onto the outline of a stranger because some wounds never fully stop looking for their reflection in every crowd. He was wrong. He spent that first night back in Calderosa in his brother's old apartment, sitting on the edge of a bed Dante had clearly never learned to make properly, surrounded by the strange, intimate debris of a life that had stopped without warning. A half-finished bottle of expensive scotch on the nightstand, a phone charger still plugged into the wall, a jacket thrown over a chair as though its owner fully intended to come back for it later that evening. Lucien sat there for a long time, not touching anything, feeling the specific, hollow ache of a man realizing he had spent years being angry at someone he would now never get the chance to forgive, or to be forgiven by. It was nearly dawn before he finally allowed himself to sleep, and even then, his last conscious thought was not of Dante at all. It was of a girl with a small scar above her eyebrow, laughing on a rooftop 9 years and an entire lifetime ago, and the terrible, tightening suspicion, not yet confirmed, but already taking root somewhere he couldn't reach, that the two griefs currently splitting his chest in half might, somehow, impossibly, belong to the very same story. It took his people 4 days to identify her. Lucien was in the back of a car, reviewing shipping manifests he had absolutely no ability to concentrate on, when his associate, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priya who had worked for him for 6 years and had never once seen him rattled by anything, slid a tablet across the seat without a word. On the screen was a driver's license photo. 28 years old. Dark hair. A small, distinctive scar above her left eyebrow that Lucien remembered, with a jolt that went through his entire body like electricity. From a summer 18 years ago, a bicycle accident, a 9-year-old girl who'd refused to cry in front of him even with blood running down her face, because she didn't want him to think she was one of those girls. Serafina Vale. Sir. Priya was watching him carefully. You went white. You know her. Lucien's hand, holding the tablet, had gone very still. I did, he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He set the tablet down on the seat between them with the careful, deliberate control of a man handling something he wasn't entirely sure wouldn't detonate. A long time ago. Family friend, Priya asked, watching him with the particular caution of someone who had learned, over 6 years, exactly which of his silences were dangerous. Something like that. He wasn't ready to say more than that. Not even to Priya, not even to himself. There were things 9 years of careful distance had taught him to keep folded up small and put away. And this, the full shape of what Serafina Vale had once meant to him, was not something he was prepared to hand to anyone, least of all in the back of a car, hours after burying the last honest hope he'd had of protecting his brother. And if she's the one who killed your brother? Outside the car window, the city slid by, the same glittering, indifferent city that had swallowed his brother whole, and, apparently, spat back out the one person Lucien had spent 9 years failing to find. He thought of the photograph, the set of her shoulders. The girl who used to fall asleep against his shoulder during summer thunderstorms, who used to make him promise, over and over, half laughing and completely serious, that he would come back for her no matter what. He thought of his brother, the version he remembered, small and frightened and hiding behind his legs, and the version he'd apparently become, the version capable of whatever had actually happened in that alley, a version Lucien had left behind 9 years ago and never once come back to protect. Something in his expression closed over, went flat and cold in a way that made even Priya, who had seen him negotiate through hostile boardrooms without blinking, sit up a little straighter. Find out everything about this woman, Lucien said quietly. Where she lives, who she talks to, what she does on Tuesdays. I want to know her better than she knows herself before she ever finds out I exist. And if it's true, if she really did it. He looked back down at the photograph one last time, at the small scar above her eyebrow, at the shoulders he still, apparently, after 9 years, would have recognized anywhere in the world. Then I'll kill her myself, he said. He didn't fully believe it, even as he said it, some small, stubborn part of him already recoiling from the sentence the moment it left his mouth. But it was the only thing he could say out loud in that car, to that photograph, that didn't require him to admit the truth sitting underneath it. That some part of him, some old and foolish and entirely unkillable part of him, had just felt his chest go tight with something that was not hatred at all, and he had absolutely no idea, yet, what he was going to do about that. The car turned a corner, and Calderosa opened up beneath them, glittering and indifferent, holding, the way it always had, every secret it had ever swallowed, patiently waiting to see which one would surface first. It would take Lucien 3 more days to finally see her in person. 3 days of watching her from photographs, from second-hand reports, from the careful, clinical distance of a man building a case. And on the 4th day, standing across a crowded street from a small apartment building with peeling paint and a stubborn landlord who apparently refused to fix a leak, Lucien Moretti would look up, and Serafina Vale, 28 years old, grieving, dangerous, and utterly unaware that the past had just found her, would look back. Neither of them would know, in that first frozen instant of recognition across a busy street, that it was already too late for either of them to walk away. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Lucien Moretti has just made a promise he has no idea he's about to break, because the woman he's hunting is the same girl he spent 9 years trying to find. If you want to see what happens when these two finally come face to face, make sure you're subscribed to Silver S Dramas, because part 2 is coming, and trust me, it's about to get a lot more complicated. Drop a comment below telling me what you think happens when Lucien realizes exactly who he's looking at, and I will see you in the next part.